Many men think protein is only a daily total problem. At the end of the night, they mentally add up the grams and assume the system got what it needed. But after 40, protein is often also a timing and distribution problem. Very little at breakfast, almost none at lunch, then one large dinner that is supposed to repair the whole day. That pattern feels normal. But older muscle is less forgiving of vague signaling. The issue is not just whether protein appears. It is whether it arrives clearly enough, often enough, to keep muscle maintenance switched on. Because after 40, the system does not interpret a missing breakfast signal and a weak lunch signal as acceptable just because dinner eventually showed up. It interprets the day as mostly silent. And then it builds accordingly. Mechanism layer. The reason this matters physiologically comes back to anabolic resistance. Older muscle generally responds less robustly to small protein doses than younger muscle. The threshold required to trigger a meaningful muscle protein synthesis response shifts upward with age. That is the foundational problem. A 25-year-old can eat 10 grams of protein at lunch and it still registers as a signal, weak but present. After 40, that same dose may fall below the activation threshold entirely. Muscle protein synthesis does not partially turn on. It barely responds at all. Research-based recommendations for older adults already argue for more deliberate protein intake than standard minimums alone would suggest. The Prati-Age study group recommended that older adults consume 1.0 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, distributed across meals, with each meal providing 25 to 30 grams of high-quality protein. That per-meal threshold is the critical detail most people skip over. Meeting a protein threshold of approximately 25 to 30 grams per meal represents a practical strategy to help preserve muscle mass and function during aging, especially when combined with physical activity. The reasoning is mechanistic, not arbitrary. That threshold roughly corresponds to the leucine content needed to saturate the mTOR signaling pathway, which initiates muscle protein synthesis. Below it, the signal is too weak to overcome the elevated resistance in older tissue. Above it, the system engages. The anabolic response to protein feeding is not always capped in the simplistic way people often describe online. When larger protein doses were consumed, the whole-body anabolic response continued to scale upward, challenging the widespread belief that anything beyond 30 grams is automatically wasted. That matters because it reframes the question. The body is not merely asking whether protein exists somewhere in the day. It is responding to whether meaningful protein arrives in a way that muscle tissue can actually use. And when that meaningful protein arrives only once, at dinner, the system has spent the majority of waking hours with no clear maintenance signal at all. Intervention layer. The practical experiment is to stop letting protein happen by accident. When subjects consumed protein distributed evenly across 3 meals, 24-hour muscle protein synthesis was approximately 25% higher compared to a pattern where the same total protein was skewed toward the evening meal. Same daily total, same food quality, different distribution, different outcome. That study alone reframes the entire conversation, because most men over 40 are already living the skewed pattern. Coffee for breakfast, a light lunch built around convenience, then a large dinner where the protein finally shows up. That is not a protein deficiency in total, it is a signaling deficiency in structure. So look at the day meal by meal. Where is the first meaningful dose? Where is the second? Where is the third? If the answer is that almost everything happens at night, then the day is probably structurally under-signaled. That does not mean dinner protein is bad. It means dinner cannot do all the work. A more useful pattern is to make each major meal strong enough to matter. Roughly 30 to 40 grams of high-quality protein at each feeding 3 times per day. That gives muscle repeated reasons to remain expensive. It also usually improves satiety, steadies energy, and makes the whole day feel less nutritionally chaotic. Protein consumed at breakfast had a stronger association with skeletal muscle hypertrophy than the same protein consumed at dinner, linked to circadian regulation through the muscle clock. That adds another layer. Timing is not only about frequency. The body may be more receptive to protein signaling earlier in the day when the circadian system primes tissue for anabolic activity. So the first meal is not just the first opportunity, it may be the most responsive window. And most men over 40 waste it on coffee and a piece of toast. Practical framework. This is especially important for men who train. If training already creates a demand for repair, but protein remains clustered into one late feeding, then the body spends most of the day with a weak rebuilding signal. That is not ideal. The framing here is not obsessive timing culture, it is signal clarity. After 40, random protein is less reliable. Deliberate protein works better because the system is asking for cleaner maintenance instructions. So the practical recommendation is simple. Build meals around adequate high-quality protein. Repeat that enough times across the day and stop relying on dinner to rescue everything. In practice, that means restructuring breakfast as the first structural priority. Eggs, Greek yogurt, a protein shake alongside a real meal. Leftover meat from last night. The specific food matters less than the dose. The goal is that by the time a man finishes breakfast, the first 30-gram signal has already been sent. Lunch follows the same logic. A meal built around a protein anchor, not around whatever is fast. Dinner then becomes the third signal instead of the only one. That shift is not complicated, but it requires intention because the default modern eating pattern works against it. The system is not asking for perfection, it is asking for repeated clarity. Because muscle maintenance is not a daily math problem alone, it is a repeated signaling problem. System interaction layer. The trade-off is that protein distribution is not the whole system. If training is absent, total calories are unstable, and sleep is poor, protein timing alone will not fix the architecture problem. A man who distributes protein perfectly across 3 meals but never trains is sending repair signals to muscle that has no reason to grow. The signal needs a demand to respond to. And a man who trains hard but sleeps 5 hours a night is degrading the hormonal environment that makes protein synthesis possible in the first place. Growth hormone, testosterone, and cortisol regulation all depend on adequate sleep architecture. So protein distribution sits inside a larger system, but it remains one of the clearest structural signals available. It interacts with training by ensuring that repair substrates are present when the body needs them, not 8 hours later. It interacts with sleep by stabilizing blood sugar across the day, which can reduce the cortisol spikes that fragment sleep onset. It interacts with body composition by improving satiety at each meal, reducing the compensatory overeating that often follows a protein-starved morning and afternoon. These are not separate benefits. They are downstream consequences of a system that receives clearer inputs. And after 40, clear inputs matter more because the system's ability to compensate for vague ones has already started to decline. The final takeaway: after 40, muscle maintenance becomes less forgiving of randomness. Protein still matters by total amount. That has not changed. But it also matters by timing, clarity, and repetition. The same 120 grams distributed across 3 clear signals will outperform 120 grams dumped into one meal at the end of the day, not because the body wastes dinner protein, but because it needed the signal hours ago, and by the time it arrived, the maintenance window had already closed twice.